is that the Quran repeatedly confirms the Psalms, the Torah, the Psalms, and the Gospels. So if the Torah describes Jerusalem as God's house, and the Psalms refers to Jerusalem temple as God's house, and Jesus in the Gospel refers to the Jerusalem temple as God's house, doesn't that mean that the Quran is also saying that the Jerusalem temple is God's house? There is no shadow of a hint in the Quran that either God has two houses. It always talks about God's house or my house, in the sacred house, the ancient house. Always talks about it in the singular. It doesn't say one of my two houses, my northern house and my southern house. And it never suggests that God has moved house. It never says, oh, I used to live in the dwelling place of the Lord used to be in Jerusalem, but now it's in the Hijaz, now it's somewhere else. There's no suggestion that either God has two houses or that God moves house. And if the Quran confirms the Torah, the Psalms, and the Gospel, then it must follow that when it talks about God's house, it is talking, or my house, it is talking about the same place that those sources talk about, I would say. And the third point is we know that several verses of the Quran are addressed to the children of Israel. I've put a little list up on the screen there. I'm not sure it's comprehensive. It's probably not. But these are some of the instances in the Quran where verses are specifically addressed to the children of Israel. We know that there were Jews within the Quran's audience. Well, wouldn't they have pointed out to the Quran author, hang on a moment, you're talking about a place that's associated with the shape of a cube. There was a place that was pointed out to Abraham. This pilgrimage that you call the Hajj sounds rather similar to our Hajj. Circumambulation, yeah, we do circumambulation. Wouldn't they have pointed all this out? Safa, Marwa, there must be some Jew there who knew about Josephus and would say, actually, yes, we've got two mountains, one called Safa and one called Marwa. You go between them, that's the place you're talking about, the place of God's judgment, and that intersects with the Valley of Gehenna. Wouldn't there have been any Jew in the Quran's audience that would have pointed this out to Muhammad? Of course they would, but this is never addressed in the text. And I would say that the reason is because the Quran author knew full well that he was referring to Jerusalem. And it was just understood by the Quran author and by his audience that when he talks about the Masjid al-Haram, that is what he was talking about. There is no reason why anyone should be surprised that the Quran refers to the Jerusalem temple as a sacred place of worship and present it as the focus of the Quran author's sacred landscape. This, I'm amazed that it's taken me in 2021 to point this out, but this really should be obvious to anybody who looks at this. I would say that the traditional narrative has people thinking in other ways. It has people thinking about the desert. It has people thinking about the traditional narrative and the tale of two cities with Mecca and Medina, and it has everybody thinking back there. And yet, if one looks at it with a fresh pair of eyes, I think it's absolutely clear that the Quran is talking about the Masjid al-Haram, is talking about Jerusalem. I'd absolutely love to hear something I've never heard before, which is somebody actually try and refute this. I've had people call me names and dismiss it as nonsense, but I would love somebody to actually go through this and actually tell me that these are all coincidences, that it's all one bizarre series of, 13 or 14 coincidences. I'd love somebody to try and argue that.
Now, to be fair, the vast majority of Muslims who are going to be watching this will not even be aware of first of all, what the Quran says or what the traditions say. All of those that I've had this kind of discussion with on the historical anachronisms in the Quran or in the traditions, almost all of them, the only ones that have been able to come back or try to defend it are the much more knowledgeable Muslims who in themselves have seen that this is a problem. They don't know how to deal with this. You're bringing up a real thorn in the side. You're bringing up the elephant in the room that no one wants to talk about in Islam. And that is so much of the premise behind the Quran and the traditions are dependent on everything taking place in the Hijaz, in the central part of Arabia. And what you're pointing out, this just cannot be, you cannot do this, especially with what we now know of all the historical and archaeological evidence that supports the biblical text, the biblical characters all existing 1,000 miles further north.
The elephant in the Quran, Jake.
We've talked about the elephant already, so we're not going to get into that.
Okay,
that was a great one, and I love what you did with that one. God bless.
So if the references in the Quran to the Masjid al-Haram are references to Jerusalem or the Jerusalem temple, what is the significance of this? Well, first of all, believers are told to pray towards it or to face towards it when they pray. In Surah 2, verse 144, and later on 149 and 150. Well, this is not any great surprise to anybody who knows the Hebrew Bible. There are various references there to facing towards Jerusalem when one prays. To find somebody in the writing a book in the traditions of Abraham and Moses to tell them to face towards Jerusalem when they pray would not be, I think, a surprising thing. Secondly, the Quran's audience are told to make a pilgrimage there in Surah 2, verse 196. Well, again, that's not unusual. That's what the book of Deuteronomy says in Deuteronomy chapter 16, where it sets out these three pilgrimages known as the Hajj. So the notion of making a pilgrimage to Jerusalem is quite a robust and well documented theme within the Bible. The Psalms. Jay, you will know better than I do that the Psalms will talk about pilgrimages to Jerusalem as a totally normal part of one's religious faith.
Yes, and we went into that. In fact, you talked about Buckeye as being part of that pilgrimage, and I was the rest up on the way to it. And of course, then you did a great job of the circumambulation and the counterclockwise and all the other material and the shaving of heads that was done all at the time of the pilgrimage. So this is well documented.
It was the departure point for the night journey. So in Surah 17, the Quran's author describes leaving the Masjid al-Haram in order to go to the furthest place of prostration, the furthest place of worship. I have an exegesis of this, but it takes a little bit too long for today, so we'll just park this for the time being. But it's traditionally understood as a journey to Jerusalem. The opposite is the case. It is a journey from Jerusalem to somewhere else, and I will explain that, but that's a whole different story. More crucially, it is a place from which the Quranic community or parts of it had been expelled and which they are ordered to fight to regain. This is a theme that is returned to in Surah 2, verse 191, and then verse 217, Surah 8, 34, and then Surah 22, verse 25. The Quran's audience are told to fight not in the Masjid al-Haram if they can help it. Don't fight in the Jerusalem temple, but to fight to regain access to the Jerusalem temple, and as the Quran says, to expel them from where they expelled you. So on my thesis, if I'm correct, we should find that members of the Quran audience have been expelled from Jerusalem. Well, let's hold that thought. It's a place that God promised them that they would enter. That's the verse, I think, or very close to the verse which talks about shaven heads. It says, Surah 48, verse 27, God promises them that they will, the Quran's audience, that they will enter the Masjid al-Haram, will enter Jerusalem with shaven heads. Seems to be a place where they make a treaty, because there is a treaty made at the Masjid al-Haram in Surah 9, verse 7. That's interesting. and it is a place from where they are eventually able to exclude their opponents. Surah 9, verse 28, Muslims or the Quran's audience are able to expel the mushrikun from the Masjid al-Haram on pain of death. So what we are looking at, what we are looking for is a place, or maybe is Jerusalem, from which has had some people expelled from it, where the Quran audience, on my theory, would be fighting to recapture it, and when they eventually do recapture it, and then exclude their opponents from it. So, in a nutshell, and I'll come back to this in a future video, Jay, if you're happy to have me back.
No, you haven't got to the best stuff yet, so that's yet to come. That's what we're going to do next. But
is it a coincidence that Jews seem to have been expelled from Jerusalem at around this time? And is it a coincidence that all the historical evidence, the contemporary or broadly contemporary evidence with Muhammad, have him fighting in Palestine? And is it a coincidence that Jerusalem itself falls to the Arabs in 637 or 638? The history supports the idea that this is what the Quran is actually all about. For the first time in 14 centuries, we are now in a position to read the Quran and actually understand what it's talking about, because it's talking about Jerusalem. It's talking about it as a holy, sacred place to which people should pray and make pilgrimage, but it's also talking about it as a military objective, and it's not some hypothetical, detached story. This is exactly what we see in history. We see Jerusalem being the center of battles during this period, and we see that the Arabs do capture Jerusalem and are able to exclude their opponents from Temple Mount.
Thanks so much, Paul. This has been good. This is an introductory to this next series of talks that you're going to be doing. We're going to end it there. This is, in some ways, what you have done is you're laying out your Jerusalem thesis even stronger. And you're not only going back to the Quran itself and looking at verses in the Quran, which support all these references to Jerusalem, all these references to the Masjid al-Haram, all these references to the pilgrimage and everything that happens there that we now know happens in Jerusalem. But you're now going to be moving into the historical, you're going to look at the historical scenario. And this is what I really want to get into. That'll be next. But until then, we need to shut it down here, stop here, and let people digest what you've already done. Come back to us. Certainly engage with Paul. He will be looking at the comments. He will be engaging with you. Sit tight. We've got an awful lot yet to do. It's yet to come. Until that time, this is Paul and Jay, 3,000 miles apart. Over and out.